What do you really know about ancient wars? Classrooms teach us about neat timelines, named heroes, and decisive victories. It all seems so orderly, so distant. But the truth is, ancient wars were anything but clean. They were chaotic collisions of climate fear, forgotten technologies, and entire peoples erased from history. The stories we're told are just a simplified surface. Beneath it lie strategies, atrocities, and motives that have been deliberately removed. As we look at these scarred landscapes, a deeper truth emerges. War exposes how a society truly functions, and revealing that truth threatens the myths of progress and morality that modern nations are built on. We're taught about armies clashing, but what about wars against nature itself? Ancient legends and archaeological evidence tell stories of drought-driven migrations, floods swallowing fortresses, and skies darkened by volcanic ash. These weren't just backdrops, they were the catalysts for conflict. Cities were abandoned, defenses were rushed, and mass graves aligned perfectly with abrupt climate shifts. Acknowledging this reframes conquest not as glory but as desperation. It forces us to confront how survival, not just ambition, has shaped human violence for millennia. Forbidden texts and suppressed artifacts deepen this unease. They describe weapons that scorched the earth and psychological warfare waged through terrifying rituals. These accounts were often dismissed as myths because they complicate the simple good versus evil narrative we prefer. When tablets detailing engineered famines or the deliberate targeting of civilians were unearthed, many quietly disappeared into private archives, while sanitized versions entered our textbooks. But now, modern technology is pulling back the curtain. Satellite imagery is exposing ancient siege scars and altered landscapes, confirming that these wars were total, ruthless, and often aimed at complete erasure, not just victory. Why the cover-up? Because history is written by the victors, and political power has always shaped how war is remembered. National origin stories legitimize borders and rulers. Defeats are softened, atrocities are reframed as necessities. Even archaeology can be biased, as funding and access often determine which truths get unearthed and which remain buried. As we digitally reconstruct these ancient battles, uncomfortable conclusions emerge. Many celebrated victories were actually societal collapses, masked as triumphs. Suppressing these facts isn't just about the past. It protects modern power structures inherited from those very conquests. What schools never teach us is that ancient wars were warnings encoded in blood and stone. They are lessons about scarcity, fear, and power that repeat themselves when ignored. As we peel back these censored layers with new technology and a better understanding of climate science, the past feels uncomfortably present. The same pressures, resource scarcity, population stress, and manipulated narratives drive conflicts today. So as we explore these forgotten battlefields, we're not just looking at distant history, we're watching rehearsals for our own time. Have you ever noticed how ancient wars in our history books feel? Neat. Like a series of heroic stories with clear winners and losers. But what if that's a carefully crafted illusion? What if these ancient conflicts weren't just isolated events, but rehearsals for the world we live in today? Every detail we ignore, every complexity we smooth over, reveals an unsettling truth. Our modern world shares the same ambitions that drove those ancient empires, the desire to control stories just as much as land. When you overlay ancient battle maps with climate data, a chilling pattern emerges. Conflict didn't just happen. It consistently followed environmental collapse, resource scarcity, and mass migration. Sound familiar? These findings suggest humanity hasn't really evolved beyond its past. Instead, we've just gotten better at forgetting. We repackage wars as destiny, not as the consequence of our own choices. Our education systems play a huge role in this collective amnesia. It's not about lying, but about leaving things out. The civilian suffering, the environmental ruin, the moral gray areas there all erased. Why? Because complexity is messy. It doesn't fit neatly into a textbook chapter. So, ancient wars become simple myths of sacrifice and glory, teaching us about valor without ever explaining the cause. Archaeology tells a different story. It uncovers famine pits next to fortresses, the skeletons of children among soldiers, and entire cities abandoned, not after a single defeat, but after survival itself became impossible. When these harsh realities are softened, history stops being a lesson and becomes a tool for obedience. preparing us to accept future conflicts without question. Political power reinforces this. Nations build their modern identity on ancient victories. Borders are justified by wars fought centuries ago. To question those wars is to question the legitimacy of power today. So, when archaeologists find evidence of shared guilt, or discover that a famous triumph was actually a mutual catastrophe, that research often faces resistance. The past starts to indict the present, revealing that our modern conflicts are just old scripts with new technology. Perhaps the most haunting lesson our schools never teach is that ancient wars rarely ended in peace. They ended in forgetting. Survivors were assimilated, languages vanished, and the real lessons were buried. This created the illusion of a clean slate, while the trauma seeped invisibly into culture. Now, as our own climate changes, as rising seas and shifting sands uncover forgotten battlefields, the earth itself is forcing us to remember. We see our own reflection in their denial, their misplaced optimism, and their faith that progress alone would save them. What schools fail to teach us about ancient wars isn't lost by accident. It's hidden by choice. And if we continue to learn war as glory instead of consequence, one day, future generations will study our ruins. Why do ancient wars feel so distant, like something from a fantasy novel? It's because we're taught a sanitized version. We learn about heroes and victories, but the real stories are buried. What schools don't teach you is that ancient wars were often rehearsals for the conflicts we see today. They weren't just about territory. They were about controlling the narrative. Who's like now? New evidence shows an unsettling pattern. As technology lets us overlay ancient battle maps with climate data, we see that major wars consistently followed environmental collapse, resource scarcity, and mass migration. Sound familiar? These findings suggest we haven't evolved past our ancestors' mistakes. We've just gotten better at forgetting them. We frame ancient wars as destiny, not as a direct consequence of choices and pressures we still face. This cycle of forgetting is reinforced by our education systems. It's not about lying, but about leaving things out. The brutal famines, the civilian suffering, the environmental ruin, these messy details are often removed. Why? Because complexity is hard to teach and even harder to control. So, ancient wars become simple myths of sacrifice and glory, teaching us about valor without ever explaining the cause. Archaeology tells a different story. It uncovers famine pits next to fortresses and children among the war dead. It shows cities abandoned not after a single battle, but after survival itself became impossible. When we ignore these facts, history becomes a tool for obedience, not a lesson in accountability. Modern politics loves this simplified history. Nations build their identity on ancient victories, justifying today's borders with wars fought centuries ago. Questioning those wars threatens the foundation of current power structures. This is why discoveries that reveal shared blame, mutual destruction, or fabricated triumphs are often suppressed or ignored. The past starts to indict the present, showing that our modern conflicts are just old scripts with new actors. Perhaps the most haunting lesson is that ancient wars rarely ended in peace. They ended in forgetting. Survivors were absorbed, languages died, and the trauma was buried, passing silently through generations. Climate shifts would reset the board, and new societies would rise, destined to repeat the same patterns. Now, as our own climate changes, rising seas and shifting deserts are literally uncovering these forgotten battlefields, forcing us to look. We see our own world reflected not in their swords and shields, but in our denial and our blind faith that progress will save us. What schools never teach you is that history isn't silent by accident. It's silent by choice. If we keep learning about war as heroic myth instead of tragic consequence, future generations will study our ruins the same way, wondering why we saw the patterns but chose to repeat them anyway. Thanks for watching. Follow for more truths that history class left out.